uh, relationship of MyBatis3 components in MyBatis. Here you can see the relationship of MyBatis3 components. The explanation about main components of MyBatis3 configuration file is given below. In MyBatis3, the SQL execution and OR mapping is implemented by integrating the following component with each other based on the definition of configuration file. MyBatis configuration file, XML file that explain operation settings of MyBatis3. It is a file that explains the details such as connecting destination for database, path of mapping file, operation settings of MyBatis, and so on. It is not necessarily to specify connection destination of database and mapping file path settings in the configuration file. When using it by integrating with Spring, however, the settings are performed when changing or extending default operations of MyBatis3. org.apache.ibbatis.session.sql session factory builder, a component to read MyBatis configuration file and generate SQL session factory. This component is not directly handled by the application class when used by integrating with Spring. org.apache.ibbatis.session.sql session factory, a component to generate SQL session. This component is not directly handled by the application class when used by integrating with Spring. org.apache.ibbatis.session.sql session, a component to provide API for SQL execution and transaction control. It is the component that plays the most important role when accessing database using MyBatis3. When this component is used by integrating with Spring, it is not directly handled by the application class. Mapper interface, an interface to call the SQL defined in mapping files typesafe. Mapping file in typesafe. Developer needs to create only the interface, as MyBatis3 automatically generates an implementation class for the mapper interface. Mapping file, XML file that explains SQL and OR mapping settings. Flow by which main components of MyBatis3 access the database is explained here. Process for accessing database can be broadly divided into two types. Processes that are performed at the start of the application. Processes 1 to 3 mentioned in this mentioned here correspond to this type. Processes that are performed for each request for the client. Processes 4 to 10 mentioned here correspond to this type. Processes that are performed at the start of the application are executed with following flow. So the number 1, application request building SQL session factory for SQL business SQL session factory for SQL session factory builder. 2, SQL session factory builder reads MyBatis configuration file for generating SQL session factory. 3, SQL session factory builder generates SQL session factory based on the definition of MyBatis configuration file. Processes that are performed for each request from the client are executed with the following flow here. 4, client request a process for the application. 5, application fetches SQL session from SQL session SQL session from 4 and 5 here, application fetches SQL session from SQL session factory that is built by using SQL session factory builder. 6, SQL session factory generates a SQL session and return it to the application. 7, application fetches the implementation object of mapper interface from SQL session. 8, application calls mapper interface method. 9, implementation object of the mapper interface calls SQL session method and request SQL execution. 10, SQL session fetches this SQL to be executed from the mapping file and executes SQL. Transaction control. Commit and rollback for the transactions are performed by calling SQL session API from the application code. However, it is not described in this flow. When integrated with Spring transaction control functionality perform commit and rollback. As a result, the API controlling SQL session is not called directly from application class. Here you can see application is connected to SQL session factory builder. SQL session factory builder MyBatis config file and SQL session factory are inside processing to run once. SQL session factory builder is connected to MyBatis config file and SQL 2 and 3 SQL session factory build is connected to SQL session factory. And 4, client is connected to application here. Applications mapper interface SQL session and mapping files are in processing to run per request. 5, application is connected to SQL session factory. 6, application SQL session factory is connected to SQL session. 7, application interacts with connected to a SQL session, and 8, application is connected to mapper interface. 9, mapper interface is connected to SQL session, and 10, SQL session is connected to mapping file. SQL session factory builder MyBatis config file, SQL session factory and SQL session are provided by MyBatis3. Mapper interface and mapping file implements by developer. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.